A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, let's turn our attention to the many homeless people who won't have a place to call home tonight. That might include families with children, young people, older people, single adults, and even people with disabilities. Katherine Kirkwood is CEO of Stable One, a mission to support the church in Victoria, providing accommodation to people in need as an expression of God's love. Katherine, a special welcome along to 2020.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, I can't help but think it's getting cold at night now, and certainly where you're working with homeless people in Victoria, they'll be feeling that the temperature is dropping, won't they?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many people that are doing it so tough, and there's such an increase of people who don't have somewhere to call home, and are, unfortunately, so many sleeping in tents and in situations like that, and it just must be awful in winter particularly.
Now, I don't want to leave listeners out of our conversation who might be tuned in all over Australia. Some places it's colder than others, but there are those who are recognising that at winter time, homelessness becomes a really difficult thing if you are not choosing to be out on the street, and you are in real trouble because things get cold. You've got a model that you are working with that actually can work wherever people might be listening to us today, called the Winter Shelter Model. What does all that mean?
Yeah, that's right. So back in 2017, Stable One piloted the first Yarra Valley winter shelter. So we're located out in the Yarra Valley in Victoria. And it basically involves churches opening their doors to take in guests who are experiencing homelessness. So it works very much supported by a whole lot of volunteers. Volunteers come from the local church communities as well as from the community more broadly. And it's a beautiful situation where you've got churches working together across denominations to facilitate a shelter. So the shelter moves around to different church venues during the week.
You know what? It's so amazing because I'm sure it's the case that churches would collaborate and work so well together if there was someone like a Katherine Kirkwood who was going to be the go-between. And how do you find, you're like the mortar between the bricks here in your community?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it should happen more often, shouldn't it? I think as churches, there's a lot of things we can disagree on, but they're actually not the big important things. I think something we can all agree on is that Jesus asked us to care for the poor. So many pages and verses in the Bible are about caring for the poor. And I think that's a really big thing that we can all go, yes, that we're actually called to do that. And we can do that together, just disregard the differences and do this together.
Lots of things remain the same. We've had a federal election and our Prime Minister is still in place. In Victoria, you've got the same government in place. There's a cost of living crisis going on. Homelessness is on the rise. I wonder if you've got any reflections about the fact that people are being very, very hard hit by cost of living pressures.
Well, I think somewhere in the Bible it says the poor will always be with you. And it's just one of those things that is so unfortunate. We would love to see an end of homelessness. Wouldn't that be wonderful? But that's going to take such a big, massive orchestrated effort between all levels of government, churches, organisations, society working together to do that. So we know that we ourselves can't solve homelessness, but what we can do is something really practical and immediate to provide relief to people who are experiencing that. And sometimes that can actually turn people's lives around. It's more than just the 3 months. It can actually change lives.
Let's talk about your model because you're bringing churches together. You're the mortar between the bricks. You're collaborating and you're coordinating a whole lot of opportunity for churches to do something. I guess that means sharing resources and, finding places. You've got to get in behind the scenes and find out what's available to be able to house people. Give us some insight here into how you work like that.
Yeah, sure. So essentially the resources that we need is church venues, so the actual buildings. And not all churches have a building, and that's fine. They can still be part of the program. We need people. We need volunteers. So churches are filled with people who hopefully want to do something practical to help those less fortunate. And, a big thing we also say is we need people with love. That's what essentially we're trying to share, is God's love, and be the practical hands and feet of Jesus. So, once you've got those ingredients, something can happen, and then other people in the community see what's happening and often jump on board as well. So, yeah, it's a really wonderful program. And here in the Yarra Valley, Stable One, we run our own local winter shelter, as I said, but we've actually set up a winter shelter network so we can support other churches in other communities to do the same thing.
When there's difficult situations around the world, like the war-torn situation in Ukraine, we celebrate that churches open their doors for refugees and people who've been displaced by war. Not much difference really in some sense, apart from maybe the trauma issues involved. But when there are people who are homeless and they're living on the streets and it's cold, it's winter time, there's not much difference. But here in Australia, do you think there's been a reluctance for churches to open spaces that they might have available to be able to house some homeless people?
Sometimes I'd say yes. I think sometimes we can get very comfortable where we're at. And not want to get uncomfortable. Does that make sense? I feel like, part of my own personal journey was I knew about poverty and I knew about suffering, but I didn't want to get up close and personal. I was very comfortable in my little bubble. But I think, when God says, hang on a minute, you actually need to do something about this and get involved and make yourself uncomfortable. So, because that's where we change as Christians, as people. God does his transforming work when we actually step outside of our comfort zone. And that can be, helping people that you wouldn't necessarily always hang out with, essentially.
Now, where are the homeless people being housed in the churches? In the main church auditorium, the sanctuary? Or are you finding the churches have got some space, maybe it's in a hall or rooms off to the side? I guess you do want to be able to close the door and you want to give people privacy, but you want to keep them, in some sense, separate to the usual activities of church life. Is this one of the things that you work with?
Yeah, usually it would be in the sanctuary that we set up the room, so to speak. So in our original pilot program, we had 7 church partners, and the shelter moved from one church to the next, so that an individual church was only hosting the shelter one night per week. In the Yarra Valley now, we work with 3. We just use 3 venues, so there's a couple of nights here, a couple of nights there, etc. But usually we do use the sanctuary space. It's a great, usually a bigger space. And, you can imagine pushing pews and chairs to, create sort of separate areas for people to sleep. And it's really, it's important to maintain safety as well. So, it actually needs to be in a visible area. So volunteers are there the whole time, including overnight as well. We have volunteers that remain awake just to make sure everyone's safe.
So just paint this picture again for us, because it's not so easy to understand how this all works. So if you're a homeless person and you actually attend a church in the Yarra Valley and you're looking for somewhere to sleep, you might be there one night, but then you might need to move to another church the next night. Is that the way it works?
Yeah, so that's how the shelter operates. A couple of nights, and we have a minibus service that will pick up the people using the shelter from a central pickup drop-off point in Lilydale. That's where we're based, and they will take them to the shelter venue. So all of our guests are assessed for suitability for the program. We can only care for people who, for instance, have managed mental health, an ability to abstain from drugs and alcohol while they're in the shelter. So there are people that we can't care for, unfortunately. But all guests are assessed and approved to stay, and we actually use an external organisation for that. We're very well supported by the local Homelessness Access Point service. So, they're assessed and approved, and then put in comms with us, and we sort of look after the rest.
Where did this start, Katherine? Was there like a ministers' fraternal gathering that said, we need to do something about the homeless problem? How do we collaborate? How did you get started? Who funds what your administration looks like to be able to make this work?
Yeah, so back in 2016, it all started because our founder, Jenny Willits, she was serving at a local food bank, and she found that she was meeting people and having conversations with people who were attending the food bank who didn't have a place to sleep that night. You know, it was people. There was a lady that, you know, she didn't look like a classic homeless person. You know, I say that in inverted commas because I think that we all have that stereotype in our head. And Jenny just didn't realise that there was a homelessness problem in her local area. You know, she like a lot of other people thought, oh yeah, it's in the city. You know, that's where the problem is, and it's not out here. But she was really convicted by God to go, I actually really need to do something about this. So within a few days, she sent out a text, and 17 people rocked up in her lounge room, and they prayed and they said to God, what will you have us do? And they believe that he told them three things. The first was to be the church. So don't just do church, be the church. The second thing was to love people like Jesus. And the third thing was, if you only help one person, it's still worth it. Because, and that's why we're called Stable One, because God cares for the one. Lots of ones.
Well, winter is on the way. The cold weather is already here in so many communities around Australia. For people to connect with you, because as you say, Katherine, you've got a model called the Winter Shelter Model. And there'll be communities that might be thinking, we need to roll our sleeves up and we need to work together with the other churches in our community to be able to make something happen. Now, no doubt the first thing that you do is just get in touch with you and find out where you can fit in. And you might have some sort of webinar or whatever you can include people into, just to be able to talk about how you can take this beyond the borders of Victoria. I know you've already got 2 affiliates in Queensland. But there might be people interested in this all over Australia. So I'm going to give the website. Katherine Kirkwood is the CEO of Stable One. Now, the website is stableone.org. Stableone.org to talk about churches collaborating to be able to meet the needs of the growing homeless community in your particular region or vicinity. Katherine, thank you so much for sharing these insights and your own heart with us today on 2020.
No worries. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.